Good afternoon. Dr. Michael Ward is an associate member of the Faculty of Theology and Religion at the University of Oxford and professor of apologetics at Houston Christian University. This past May, I had the privilege of attending one of his lectures inside C.S. Lewis's Oxford home, the Kilns. His lecture aided my understanding of the Chronicles of Narnia by highlighting key elements of the argument he makes in his award-winning and best-selling book, Planet Narnia, The Seven Heavens and the Imagination of C.S. Lewis. We parted ways at the Kilns, but a series of providential events led me to Holyrood Catholic Church in Oxford, where Dr. Ward, Father Ward, serves as an assistant priest alongside his work as an academic. After attending my first Mass, I discussed cinematic arts with Dr. Ward, to which he is no stranger, having recently co-authored a book called Popcorn with the Pope, a guide to the Vatican film list, as well as having played the part of Lewis's vicar in the 2021 biopic, The Most Reluctant Convert, The Untold Story of C.S. Lewis. I did not expect that meeting in Oxford would lead me to my introducing him at this conference, but it is my great privilege and honor to welcome my new friend and our final keynote speaker, Dr. Michael Ward.
Thank you, Jacob. Congratulations to you all on surviving till this final keynote. Congratulations to Jason Lepajärvi for hosting this magnificent conference. Congratulations to President Robin Baker for hiring Jason's services. Now, those of you who have read the Undiscovered C.S. Lewis that Bruce was talking about the other night, and my contribution to it, which was called Planet Narnia Revisited, may be wondering whether my talk today will just be reheating what I wrote there. Let me reassure you, it won't. The title for today's talk was proposed long before I knew exactly what I was going to say, but only that it would be connected somehow or other with the arguments of my book, Planet Narnia. What I'm about to say now is actually brand new. Never even talked about it with friends or colleagues. So this is the world premiere of this idea. And whether it will be a hit, a flop, or land somewhere in between, you will decide. So Planet Narnia Revisited is the umbrella title for a talk which has as its specific title, Signifying Nothing, New Thoughts on the Name Narnia. And all I plan to do is share some fresh thinking I've recently done on the name Lewis gives to his imagined country. These are just some thoughts, some ideas, not a hard and fast argument or case. But at the very least, I hope we will explore in the next 55 minutes or so some interesting and possibly even illuminating lines of inquiry that connect to larger areas of Lewis's work as a literary historian, a Christian apologist, not to mention his personal pilgrimage, and to his artistic output as a novelist and poet. The name Narnia. Let's start at the very beginning. A very good place to start. The first ever mention of Narnia that Lewis made in public occurs in the opening chronicle, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, in the following exchange. "May I ask, O Lucy, daughter of Eve," said Mr. Tumnus, "how you have come into Narnia?" "Narnia? What's that?" said Lucy. "This is the land of Narnia," said the Faun, "where we are now, all that lies between the lamppost and the great castle of Cair Paravel on the eastern sea." "Narnia, what's that?" asks Lucy. And the answer she gets is a quick lesson in geography. Narnia is a land, a country, an area that can be depicted on a map. All right, but what does Narnia mean etymologically? Lewis didn't invent languages like Tolkien did, so we can't explore the history of the name as we might with an invented word in Quenya or Sindarin. We can only look at the explanations Lewis himself gave outside the Narnia Chronicles as to the origin of the word. And he gave two explanations. One explanation connects Narnia to a real-world place called Nani, a hill town in Italy. And the other explanation links it to the word inane in English or inane in Latin. But before we dig deeper into these explanations, why should we even care? What does it matter? Well, why does it matter that England means more than just the land south of Scotland and east of Wales? England etymologically means the land of the Angles. And the Angles are a tribe from North Germany who invaded some centuries ago. So that's interesting. And then you could ask, well, why were the Angles called Angles? And apparently it has quite possibly a connection to the peninsula where they lived, which was shaped a bit like a hook, which is where we get the term angling, hooking fish, or possibly even the word ankle, the bendy thing in the foot, that thing down there. Now, isn't that interesting? So hopefully just from an intellectual point of view, we could find some value in trying to trace down the meaning of Narnia, but also more emotionally. We might say, if we enjoy the Narnia Chronicles, that we have perhaps enjoyed, maybe even loved, spending time in that imaginative space. Think of all the hours, the days maybe you have been located, imaginatively speaking, in that country that lies between the lamppost and Cair Paravel on the Eastern Sea. If you love it, and I've loved it since I was about 5, I realized the other day that I've now been reading Narnia for more than half a century. If you love it, you want to know everything you can about it. Owen Barfield wrote in Poetic Diction, a work that Lewis and Tolkien greatly admired, "Love is the begetter of intimate knowledge. For what we love is not tedious, but delightful to observe minutely." Wouldn't it be worth knowing more about the origin of the name of that place that you have loved spending time in, if you could unearth it? Narnia is the only invented name, other than Aslan, that appears in every single chronicle. It's a creative choice that matters much more than most such decisions Lewis made as he wrote these stories. Compare the names of 2 other fictional countries, Erewhon and Utopia. Erewhon, the fictional land of Samuel Butler's 1872 novel, is an anagram of nowhere. And if you don't pick up on that, you're missing a trick. Likewise, Sir Thomas More's Utopia, or Utopia, means no place in Greek, but it sounds like it could mean good place. And again, if you fail to register that satirical wordplay, you're missing out something that would helpfully inform your reading. Of the 2 explanations Lewis gave as to the origin of Narnia, let's look first at the one that has to do with the real-world place in central Italy. We know about this because when Walter Hooper asked where he found the word Narnia, Lewis showed him Murray's Small Classical Atlas, edited G.B. Grundy, 1904, which he acquired when he was reading the classics with Mr. Kirkpatrick at Great Bookham. On plate 8 of the atlas is a map of ancient Italy. Lewis had underscored the name of a little town called Narnia simply because he liked the sound of it. Here's the page from the atlas. You'll see that Lewis underlined quite a few place names with his pen, not just Narnia. Hooper explains elsewhere that in the atlas, Lewis followed with his pen the military campaigns described by Tacitus and others. Those others, no doubt, would have included Martial, Livy, Pliny the Elder, and so on. So rather than saying that Lewis underlined the word Narnia simply because he liked the sound of it, it would have perhaps been slightly more accurate for Hooper to say that Lewis both underlined it, as he underlined many names on the map, and that he liked the sound of it. Very small distinction, but I'm trying to sift the evidence very carefully. In another place, Walter Hooper wrote, Lewis underscored the name Narnia on the map, and he told me, when he gave me the atlas, that this is the source of the name he gave his imaginary creation. You have to look closely to see the ink mark under the word Narnia, but it was that name on that page that gave him what is now one of the most famous names in the world. That's the first explanation Lewis gives. He links Narnia to that Italian hill town he'd known about since his teens and said he liked the sound of the word. We'll come back to this later on. But for now, let's look at the other explanation, which comes from a letter he wrote in 1955. This letter only became known about in 2009 when it was put up for auction. And this means it doesn't appear in the collected letters, the third volume of which was published in 2006. And as a result, it hasn't received much attention. The letter runs as follows. Dear correspondent, now who are you? The signature looks like Titbit d'Alençon, but that seems improbable. About Narnia. Yes, it's a pity about the Umbrian town, which I had quite forgotten when I invented my country. The IA is merely terminal, as in Italia or Armenia. As for Narn, I always thought Latin inane one of the loveliest words, purely on phonetic grounds, nothing to do with vacuity. And you couldn't get English people to pronounce it as I wanted unless you put in an R. The Narnia are old friends of mine, but don't come in here. But do tell me who you are. Yours sincerely, C.S. Lewis. Now, Titbit d'Alençon was in fact a man called Talbot d'Alessandro, and he later had some correspondence with Tolkien. Lewis tells d'Alessandro that he had quite forgotten the Umbrian town when he invented his fictional country. Does that contradict what he told Walter Hooper? Not necessarily, I think. Though Lewis had forgotten the Umbrian town when he named his fictional country, that doesn't have to mean it played no part in his creative choice, only that it wasn't consciously in his mind at the moment of decision. Later, he remembered it had played a part, which is why Lewis told Hooper what he told him. In It All Began With a Picture, a short article about the origin of the Narnia Chronicles for the junior section of the Radio Times, Lewis told his young readers a man writing a story is too excited about the story itself to sit back and notice how he is doing it. In fact, that might stop the works, just as if you start thinking about how you tie your tie, the next thing is you find you can't tie it. And afterwards, when the story is finished, he has forgotten a good deal of what writing it was like. Lewis had an incredibly retentive memory for some things, but also a rather unexpected capacity to forget other things. Walter Hooper once started quoting some lines from a poem called Skazens, and Lewis said, "That's a good poem." And Hooper said, "You wrote it." And Lewis had completely forgotten it. Likewise, Owen Barfield records somewhere how Lewis had completely forgotten that a poem that he, Barfield, had written was about Lewis. Lewis had read it, knew that Barfield had written about him, Lewis, but then later, a few years later, I don't know exactly the period, he'd completely forgotten it. I don't know how many poems have been written about you, but I suspect those that have, you remember. So Lewis's forgetfulness here is in some ways surprising, but in other ways not at all surprising. The most interesting portion of that letter I just quoted is what Lewis says about Narn. As for Narn, I always thought Latin inane one of the loveliest words, purely on phonetic grounds, nothing to do with vacuity. And you couldn't get English people to pronounce it as I wanted unless you put in an R. Now this chimes closely with, but not exactly with, what Green and Hooper say in their biography, that Lewis liked the sound of the name Nani. But here it's not the name of the Umbrian hill town that he likes, but a somewhat similar sounding Latin word. Lewis says he loves it on phonetic, not semantic grounds. Which puts me somewhat in mind of that letter where he says, "I was astonished when someone," he means Tolkien, "first showed me that by writing cellar door as cellar door, one produces an enchanting proper name. Lewis likes the sound of the Latin inane, but if he liked the sound of the whole word, why didn't he use the whole word for creating his imagined country? Just add in the necessary R and the ending IA to give us Inanea. Why are we not reading the Chronicles of Narnia? Instead of repurposing the whole word that he likes the sound of, Lewis zeroes in on its middle syllable, nan. But he could have found that sound in many other words. Why are we not reading the Chronicles of Narnia? Well, non-breadia. Or non-Narnia. He zeroes in on the middle syllable. Yes, but it's evidently nan as part of inane that he finds phonetically lovely. It's not just nan in and of itself. The syllable has significance for him in the context of the larger word, and he uses the part synecdochically to stand for the whole. So there must be something about inane that is of interest or importance to him. What could it be? Well, this is a thought that I have had, and I could well be mistaken. This is all a kind of educated guesswork about a thing that I love. But unless I'm mistaken, this peculiar interest Lewis has in the word inane relates to his cosmological thinking. Inane means vacuity, which is not a very lovely thing. In fact, you might argue it's not really a thing at all. Yet, inane sounds lovely to Lewis's ears. He was enamored of phonetic subtleties, so he once said, and many of his poems show that to be true to a most extraordinary extent. With the word inane, phonetically it sounds lovely, semantically it means nothing. Literally, nothing. The same word can evoke two very different responses depending on how you take it, not unlike cellar door and cellar door. Lewis would have encountered the word inane in numerous places in his Latin authors, and I've not done a comprehensive survey of his classical reading to see where it most often occurs. But just to give you one notable example, in the epigrams of Martial, a work we know Lewis to have been fully familiar with, he would have read, I'm sure he did read, on numerous occasions, the following epigram: Nullos esse Deos inane cellum ad firmat Sidius, probatque quodse factum dum neget hec videt beatum. Which means there are no gods. Heaven is empty, Sidius affirms, and proves this by the fact that even as he makes such a denial, he sees prosperity. He gets away with it. Inane cellum, heaven is empty. Which puts me in mind of Lewis's earliest work of Christian apologetics, the problem of pain, which he opens, as you will recall, with the following words. Not many years ago, when I was an atheist, if anyone had asked me, why do you not believe in God, my reply would have run something like this: look at the universe we live in. By far the greatest part of it consists of empty space, completely dark and unimaginably cold. The bodies which move in this space are so few and so small in comparison with the space itself that even if every one of them were known to be crowded as full as it could hold with perfectly happy creatures, it would still be difficult to believe that life and happiness were more than a byproduct to the power that made the universe. That was Lewis's vision of the cosmos when he was an atheist. It was a place of emptiness, darkness, coldness. After he became a Christian, his thinking underwent a 180-degree revolution. What he had perceived as a dreadful vacuity, he now saw as the radiant heavens. The heavens which are telling the glory of God. In the words of Psalm 19, which he came to regard as the greatest poem in the Psalter and one of the greatest lyrics in the world. A crucial moment in his conversion story, as we all know, occurred in September 1931 when he had that long nighttime conversation with Tolkien and Dyson. A conversation that not only led to Lewis's embrace of Christianity, but that also led Tolkien to compose the poem that we now know by the title Mythopoeia. This poem was written as from, Tolkien said, philomythos to misomythos, the myth lover to the myth hater. The myth hater at that point, of course, being Lewis himself. Here are some lines from Mythopoeia that are relevant to our inquiry. You look at trees and label them just so, for trees are trees, and growing is to grow. You walk the earth and tread with solemn pace one of the many minor globes of space. A star's a star, some matter in a ball, compelled to courses mathematical, amid the regimented, cold, inane, where destined atoms are each moment slain. He sees no stars, who does not see them first, of living silver made, that sudden burst to flame like flowers beneath an ancient spring, an ancient song, whose very echo after music long has since pursued. There is no firmament, only a void, unless a jewelled tent, myth-woven and elf-patterned, and no earth, unless the mother's womb, whence all have birth. Now, I trust you noticed Tolkien's use of the word inane there, capitalized, as is often the case when the word is used in its noun form rather than in its adjectival form. The Oxford English Dictionary defines inane in this substantive sense as empty space, vacuity, the formless void of infinite space. Its earliest recorded usage dates from 1677. But as a noun, inane is very unusual. It's common enough as an adjective, but as a noun you hardly ever read it or see it, or hear it. So perhaps Tolkien's use of the term in this form lodged in Lewis's mind and made him mull over the word and its Latin source. In Latin, it's a third declension noun. Look at the nominative plural here, in Narnia, meaning empty spaces. Tolkien's poem Mythopoeia and his larger arguments about Christianity presented Lewis with a choice between the regimented cold inane and a jewelled tent myth woven. We know which one he chose. Intriguingly, Tolkien would go on to use the word Narn, N-A-R-N, in his own invented language of Sindarin. According to the index to the Silmarillion, Narn signifies a tale made in verse, but to be spoken and not sung. Narn Ichin Húrin, the tale of the children of Húrin, often referred to simply as the Narn, is one of Tolkien's many posthumous publications. Now, I've no knowledge as to whether Tolkien was aware of this Sindarin word, nor, for that matter, precisely when Tolkien invented it. But it's a striking similarity. It's a thought I share with you. Tolkien scholars in the audience can perhaps provide more information. But back to Mythopoeia. Lewis's attention would have been drawn to the appearance of the word inane there because, while still a young man recovering from his war wounds, he had already acquired an interest in vacuity as he read the French philosopher Henri Bergson. A momentous experience, he said. Momentous enough for him to write about it more than 30 years later in Surprised by Joy. It was Henri Bergson who taught Lewis to avoid, he says, the snares that lurk about the word nothing. It was thanks to Bergson that Lewis dropped the absurd notion that reality is an arbitrary alternative to nothing. One starry night in the winter of 1927, so before Lewis's conversion, Lewis went to bed early, but pulled up my blind to see the stars, thought suddenly of Bergson. As you do. Bergson had taught Lewis about the snares that lurk about the word nothing. Nothingness, inanity, vacuity, hollowness, these would become focal points of interest for Lewis over the succeeding years. He'd go on to spend huge amounts of scholarly and creative energy in his career as a writer in this area of the English language. Both as an academic and as a novelist, he became almost preoccupied with this fault line that separates the two opposing cosmologies. Is the cosmos inane or myth-woven? For instance, in one of his academic essays, Lewis reports that space, as a concrete, the abyss, the vacuity in which all material objects exist, could not have existed in the 14th century because the thing meant did not exist for the human mind. The drama of existence was not performed against any such forbidding backcloth. There was no abyss. Man looked up at a patterned, populous, intricate, finite cosmos, a builded thing, not a wilderness, heaven or spheres, not space. The first writer on record as using space in the modern sense is John Milton. So Lewis records in The Discarded Image, quoting from Paradise Lost, where Milton writes that space may produce new worlds. A passage from Paradise Lost, incidentally, where Lewis also found the phrase spirits in bondage, which would give him, of course, the title of his first ever publication. The new sense of space that Milton coined carries with it, Lewis argues, the idea that the heavenly bodies move in a pitch-black and dead-cold vacuity. The older conception, the pre-Miltonic conception of nature, by contrast, saw the universe, Lewis says, as tingling with anthropomorphic life, dancing, ceremonial, a festival, not a machine. That word tingling is often used by Lewis with a double meaning, because in Anglo-Saxon, tingle means a star. If we had time here, surveying briefly his academic engagement with this topic, we would here take a look at his essay, The Empty Universe, that preface to the book by D.E. Harding, for more on how the older conception was evacuated of meaning. But turning to his fiction, the obvious place to look is Out of the Silent Planet, when the hero, Elwyn Ransom, traveling to Mars, looks out of the window of his spaceship and marvels at what he sees. There were planets of unbelievable majesty and constellations undreamed of. There were celestial sapphires, rubies, emeralds, and pinpricks of burning gold. They seemed to grow brighter as he looked. Stretched naked on his bed, a second Danae, he found it night by night more difficult to disbelieve in old astrology. Almost he felt, wholly he imagined, sweet influence pouring or even stabbing into his surrendered body. A little bit later, we're told that Ransom becomes aware that a nightmare long engendered in the modern mind by the mythology that follows in the wake of science was falling off him. He had read of space. At the back of his thinking for years had lurked the dismal fancy of the black, cold vacuity, the utter deadness which was supposed to separate the worlds. He had not known how much it affected him till now that the very name, space, seemed a blasphemous libel for this empyrean ocean of radiance in which they swam. He had thought it barren. He saw now that it was the womb of worlds. No, space was the wrong name. Older thinkers had been wiser when they named it simply the heavens which declared the glory. Space was the wrong name. How ironic, then, that publishers now issue this novel as the first book in the Space Trilogy. Lewis himself never called it that, and I'm sure he would not have done. It's much better to call it either the Cosmic Trilogy or the Ransom Trilogy. Some people have suggested we should call it the Heavens Trilogy, but I don't think that's ever going to catch on. The Ransom Trilogy is the preferred option in my view. And you may remember how in Perelandra, the second novel, the Unman repeatedly calls out Ransom's name, and then, when Ransom asks what he wants, replies nothing. Ransom? What? Nothing. Ransom? What? Nothing. Ransom? What? Nothing. This happens 100 times, 1,000 times, driving Ransom to distraction. Eventually, he decides not to respond. We're told if he must hear the unman say either the word ransom or the word nothing 1,000,000 times, he would prefer the word ransom. That's enough for now on the inane explanation of the name Narnia and Tolkien's possible influence thereon, first in Myth of Peer and then just possibly with his Sindarin word Narn. We now turn back to the Narni explanation and what might underlie it. And we'll get into this by thinking more deeply about the passage I just read from Out of the Silent Planet, with its reference to Ransom as a second Danae, who feels sweet influence pouring into his surrendered body. Who is Danae? In Greek mythology, Danae was the maiden into whose lap Zeus, or Jupiter in Roman mythology, released a shower of gold, which led to the birth of Perseus. Lewis loved the myth of Danae and refers to it in several places. He saw in it, as he saw in so many pagan myths, a prefiguration of the true myth, the historical story of Jesus Christ, the true treasure sent down from heaven. In the world of mythological fiction, the king of the gods showered Danae with gold. In the world of historical fact, God overshadows Mary with the Holy Spirit. This great myth became fact when the Virgin conceived, Lewis writes in an essay published in 1944. And let's spend a little time on that essay, Myth Became Fact, because it will lead us, albeit by a somewhat circuitous route, back to Narni, the Italian hill town. This is how that essay begins. My friend Quirinius has advanced the charge that none of us are in fact Christians at all. According to him, historic Christianity is something so barbarous that no modern man can really believe it, etc., etc. We don't have time to go into all of this. Who is Quirinius? In medieval legend, Quirinius was a mighty warrior who fought with giants and founded the county of Cornwall in the southwest of England. But who is Lewis's friend Quirinius? The name is obviously a pseudonym. To find the answer to that, we turn to an earlier version of Myth Became Fact entitled In Reply to Mr. R. Here's the first page of it from a copy in the Bodleian Library at Oxford. As you see, it's subtitled in Lewis's handwriting, A Paper Read to the Socratic Club. He then goes on to say, Mr. R, in a brilliant paper, has told those of us who defend Christianity that, and then we jump to the typescript, that we are not in fact Christians. The implication was that historic Christianity is something so barbarous that no modern man can really believe it, etc., etc. And then we're back more or less to the published version. So Quirinius, in the published version of Myth Became Fact, is the Mr. R of this earlier version. Okay, but who is Mr. R? We need to find someone whose surname begins with R, very probably, who has a connection to Cornwall, disbelieves in Christianity, and is likely to have presented a paper at the Socratic Club. There's only one candidate, and that is A.L. Rowse, historian, Fellow of All Souls College, Oxford, atheist, and author of A Cornish Childhood, A Cornishman at Oxford, A Cornishman Abroad, A Cornish Anthology, Cornish Stories, The Cornish in America, Three Cornish Cats, amongst other Cornish titles. Now, I'm certainly not the first person to make this identification between Mr. R and A.L. Rowse. The first person to do that, as far as I'm aware, was Arend Smilde, the Dutch Lewis scholar, in an article in Zenzucht back in 2019. But interestingly, and I sort of confirmed this with Jim Stockton earlier this afternoon in his workshop on the Socratic Club, Rouse's name doesn't appear in any of the extant records of the Socratic Club, which is why this is something of a relatively recent discovery. If there were any doubts about the identification, the typescript removes it, because though Lewis took care to cloak Mr. R at the start, he then forgot. And on this later page, he gives the game away here and here, writing Rowse and then having to correct it. A.L. Rowse, Alfred Leslie Rowse, became a Fellow of All Souls the same year that Lewis became a Fellow of Magdalen. So they were very much contemporaries in terms of their careers, even though Lewis was 5 years older. They first met at a dinner in Oxford in 1926, and they ate with each other on at least another 2 occasions. But they didn't become friends. Indeed, on one occasion, after Lewis subjected Rowse to a grueling cross-examination and then left the room, Rowse swivelled round to his host and said, "I never knew Lewis was such a fool, such a fool." He was a very outspoken and acerbic man, A.L. Rowse. He'd been brought up a Christian, but abandoned his faith soon after arriving at Oxford. He later described himself as a high church atheist. He said in his diary, "All this beautiful myth about Jesus being the Son of God, Mary, the Mother of God, God himself becoming incarnate in man, etc., is quite untrue," so he wrote. His real religion, he said, was rooted in his apprehension of life as beauty. "My ultimate values are aesthetic, not moral or religious," he said. Writing poetry became my secret religion. And he wrote a huge amount of it, many of his poems being descriptions of paintings that he admired. He was a connoisseur of fine art and was, as he says, possessed by the aim to render in words what I saw in pictures, the desire to arrest the moment. Now, C.S. Lewis read at least one of Rowse's many books, namely The England of Elizabeth, 1950, referring to it in his O Hell volume, English Literature in the 16th Century, excluding drama. And Rowse, as it happens, reviewed Lewis's O Hell volume, reviewed it warmly, praising the book for its vitality and magnanimity. A short while later, Lewis happened to bump into Rowse on a train and thanked him for the review. He was always polite and gentlemanly, wrote Rowse, notwithstanding that grueling cross-examination he'd previously received at his hands. Rowse admired Lewis as a first-rate mind, an excellent scholar, but had no time for what he called the nonsense realm of theology. Rowse was highly critical of the problem of pain, found a grief observed nauseating, and said that Lewis's absurd book on miracles is enough to undermine anyone's faith. He spoke more favourably of the Narnia Chronicles, saying that Lewis had original talent as a writer, best seen in his children's stories, and admitting that something of poetry came through in his children's fables, all of his work that I could take. And given Rouse's possible role in helping Lewis arrive at the name Narnia, which I assure you we are slowly getting round to, this is amusing to see. Lewis's opinions of Rowse were likewise somewhat mixed. Though he respected him as a Tudor historian, he didn't think much of Rowse as a literary critic. In a couple of letters written within a month of his own death, Lewis rejoiced that, now he was retired, he was under no professional obligation to read Rouse's new book on Shakespeare's sonnets. Lewis and Rowse debated each other at the Socratic Club, I believe, in 1944. According to Rowse, Lewis spoke first, and after my speech, he had to go, leaving me in possession of the field, if not of the argument. Having been unable to respond in person to Rouse's speech, Lewis appears to have written Myth Became Fact to make up for the omission. Having said all that, we now return to the myth of Danae and the shower of gold, and how it appears not now in the Ransom trilogy, but in Lewis's poetry. In his poem The Meteorite, the shower of gold gets another outing. Among the hills, a meteorite lies huge, and moss is overgrown, and wind and rain with touches light made soft the contours of the stone. Thus easily can earth digest a cinder of sidereal fire, and make the translunary guest thus native to an English shire. Nor is it strange these wanderers find in her lap their fitting place, for every particle that's hers came at the first from outer space. All that is earth has once been sky. Down from the sun of old she came, or from some star that travelled by too close to his entangling flame. Hence, if belated drops yet fall from heaven, on these her plastic power still works, as once it worked on all the glad rush of the golden shower. And that last line obviously links the poem to the myth of Danae. The poem was originally published, as you see at the top there, in a magazine called Time and Tide in December 1946. Here's the front cover of that issue. Here's the section of new poetry in which it appeared. And if we zoom in, we can see Lewis's poem on the top right. But also next to it, on the facing page, is a poem entitled On Richard Wilson's Lake of Narnie by, of all people, A.L. Rowse. Now, I must thank Joe Forty, a long-time member of the Oxford Lewis Society, for bringing this page to my attention. Rouse's poem is about a painting of Narnie by one Richard Wilson, an 18th century Welsh artist. This is the picture that Rowse is writing about. It was actually called the Vale of Narnie, not the Lake of Narnie. Rowse made a little mistake there. And this is how Rouse's poem goes. The tops of the pines are like a balloon floating in the Italian sky, an emerald bubble that seems to move and yet is held eternally. To left, the pillared cypresses stand on guard above the stream, whose placid surface mirrors a wood where all is dark as in a dream. The roadway winds around to the right, on the bluff a ruined tower. The lake is bathed in golden light, magic in this surrendered hour. At the foot of the trees, a peasant troop of gay and coloured figures lie, taking their delightful ease under the mellow April sky. Here in the foreground, look at these. A contadino leans on his crook, takes the hand of his girl in his. So they stand and exchange a look that lasts forever. O moving light, liquid and lovely on mountain and stream, on country boy and girl that stand in the green landscape of a dream. Stillness and innocence and peace, so let them stand, so let them be, so let the loving light suffuse the Italian sky eternally. Now, we don't know for a fact that Lewis ever saw this double spread from Time and Tide. I must be entirely frank about that. But the coincidence of his meteorite poem being printed directly opposite Rouse's poem on Narnie is so striking that I find it hard to believe he did not see it. And assuming he did, I can think of at least 4 reasons why Lewis would have found it thought-provoking, and why it might have even given him that little seed of a creative idea that he ingested without quite realizing it, so that in a couple of years' time, when he started writing The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe in earnest, it would flower into the name of his invented country that lies between the lamppost and Cair Paravel on the Eastern Sea. Now, the first of these 4 reasons is that of all places in Italy, indeed of all places in Europe, Narnie has a major claim to fame, meteoritically speaking. In the year of our Lord, 921, numerous meteorites fell on and around Narnie. Long afterwards, the largest of these could be seen partly submerged in the river. So says an article about the history of meteorites in the magazine New Scientist. Indeed, what happened at Narnie in 921 was the very first recorded example in European history of a full meteorite. A full meteorite is one that's observed falling, as opposed to a find meteorite, one that's found after the fact. And the only full meteorite that's any earlier than this Narnie one landed in Japan. Here's a web page from the Meteoritical Society detailing some of the relevant information. Now, I assume that Lewis, with his lifelong interest in and extensive knowledge of astronomy, was aware of Narni's place in meteoritic history and would have been amused to see his poem about a meteorite printed opposite a poem about that very town. By the way, his own poetic interest in meteorites long predates this 1946 poem. Take a look at The Star Bath in Spirits in Bondage for a much earlier example. So this meteoritic reason is its own thing, and if you're keeping track of my explanatory schematic, it qualifies as its own sub-root of the Narni explanation. Then the fact that this poem about Narni was written by Lewis's sparring partner, A.L. Rowse, would have led Lewis to pay even closer attention, and for an additional 3 reasons, which I'm labeling A, myth, B, anti-inanity, and C, Cornish treasure. First, myth, Here's a poem by a man who doesn't believe in God or heaven, yet the poem presents a picture of a kind of hymn to eternal beauty. The emerald bubble of the trees in the first stanza is held eternally in the Italian sky. The look exchanged between the lovers is a look that lasts forever. And in the final stanza, the loving light suffuses the Italian sky again, eternally. Love and light and the earth and the sky are all momentarily one. Is not the sky itself a myth? Lewis asks in Myth Became Fact. What is Rowse doing here? His cosmos has suddenly become almost sacramental. One can imagine Marshall's epigram springing to Lewis's mind as he read this poem. Nullos esse deos inane celum adfirmat Rowse. There are no gods, heaven is empty, Rowse affirms, and yet he disproves this by the fact that even as he makes such a denial, he sees eternity, and then bothers to write a poem about it. Rowse is writing a poem that seems at odds with his own skepticism, his own atheism. In that respect, he somewhat resembles Gaius and Titius in The Abolition of Man, of whom Lewis wrote, "They are better than their principles." Gaius and Titius, in reality Alec King and Martin Ketley, found it very difficult to be thoroughgoing and consistent subjectivists. Belief in objective value kept breaking in, despite their best efforts to suppress it. Likewise, Rowse shows here in this beautiful and sensitive poem that he's not a very successful denier of eternal personal value. It keeps breaking in. Rouse's surrendered cosmos, note that word, just like Ransom's surrendered body, is open to magic, bathed in golden light. Not so very different from that golden shower of Lewis's own poem. So that's the first Rowse-related reason why Lewis might have been specially interested in this poem, assuming he saw it. It's promisingly mythic. A second reason why it might have snagged his attention is that, bizarrely enough, Rowse was someone who often inveighed against people he considered inane. He was very much anti-inanity. He uses the words inane, inanity, inanition recurrently, almost excessively. Let me give you just a few examples. In his autobiography, A Cornish Childhood, Rowse talks about the blue-collar china clay families among whom he grew up. I did not appreciate their inanity at the time, he says. Genuine writers, he says, who have come from the working class, like D.H. Lawrence, and like me, he's saying, know the inanity of the people. He enjoyed railing against what he saw as the intellectual poverty of his own upbringing, scorning the people among whom he was raised. Not for nothing did Lewis once describe Rowse as fire-spitting. In his poetry, we find Rowse wishing to eject poison into all its folly, human and inane. His preference is rather the animal than the inane. He has contempt for the common, the usual, the inane. Those are just 3 poems in which the word appears. There are others. The writer Raymond Mortimer, in a letter to Rowse, speaking of his reactions to a Cornish childhood, remarked, "It seems to me that you entertain illusions about the superior intelligence of the aristocracy. I believe inanity, as you call it, exists about equally in all classes." Now, did C.S. Lewis read enough of Rouse's works to pick up on this tick in his vocabulary? Probably not. Did Rowse use these words also to a noticeable extent in his conversation and in debate? Possibly. These are really unanswerable questions, but I feel I should raise them because Rouse's frequent recourse to that word inane and its cognates is yet another of the remarkable coincidences emerging from these pages of Time and Tide. Another one, incidentally, is that Martin Skinner, whose name you see on this double spread, the author of the New Lunacy poem, was an Oxford man known to both Lewis and Rowse. And a few years later, in the mid-1950s, Skinner would go on to write a long narrative poem, for which, so A.L. Rowse noted, C.S. Lewis and I have joint responsibility. For I said to Skinner, write an Arthurian poem, and C.S.L. said to him, write about the return of Arthur. It was to Skinner, by the way, that Lewis described Rowse as fire-spitting. But all that's incidental. The third and final reason why, final Rowse-related reason why this poem might have caught Lewis's attention is that Rowse was a Cornishman. He came from a part of the country that Lewis had a special reason to think well of, symbolically speaking. I mean, in relation to those spiritual symbols of permanent value, the seven heavens of the medieval cosmos. Spiritual symbols of permanent value that are especially worthwhile in our own generation, Lewis called the seven heavens. In his prologue to Spirits in Bondage, Lewis's opening line is this: "As of old, Phoenician men to the Tin Isles sailing." And in his 1935 poem, The Planets, Lewis writes of Jove's orbit, filled and festal, faster turning with arc ampler. From the Isles of Tin, Tyrian traders in trouble steering came with his cargoes, the Cornish treasure that his ray ripens. Cornwall is a part of the British Isles rich in natural deposits of tin, and tin, of course, was the metal of Jove, of Jupiter, Lewis's favourite planet, the one he said he'd been born under, and the one, so I argue, in Planet Narnia that provides the imaginative blueprint of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So even as Lewis looked at these pages from Time and Tide, which I feel sure he must have done, though I repeat I cannot prove it, he was working on his book Miracles, a preliminary study that will be published the following May. His poem, The Meteorite, serves as that book's epigraph. Lewis saw in meteorites an objective correlative of God's miraculous action in mundane affairs. Jupiter raining things down upon earth in pagan myths is a foreshadowing of the true God acting in extraordinary ways in the natural world. Miracles, as I argue, in chapter 10 of Planet Narnia, would set up Lewis for the writing of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, something I don't have time to go into here. Suffice it to say that we can trace, I think, a through line of planetary imagery, and specifically of Jupiter imagery, from these pages in Time and Tide to the monarchical supernatural world defended in Miracles, and thence to the first chronicle of Narnia with its jovial spirit. And then, having written one planetary chronicle, Lewis thought he'd write another, and then another, and eventually decided to do all seven. He didn't have the whole scheme in mind from the start. But it's not hard to imagine, I think, that Lewis took the name Narni with him as he made this authorial progression, albeit forgetting its source in the heat of composition, and then remembering it later. Let me conclude. Lewis, once upon a time, viewed the cosmos as inane, a nothingness, a vast black space empty of purpose. But then he became a Christian and saw it differently. In the opening chapters of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, there's some delicious proleptic irony about whether Narnia is something or nothing. the children looked into a room that was quite empty except for one big wardrobe, the sort that has a looking glass in the door. There was nothing else in the room at all except a dead blue bottle on the windowsill. "Nothing there," said Peter, and they all trooped out again, all except Lucy. "Nothing there," says Peter. The dead insect on the windowsill appears to confirm that this spare is an empty, lifeless place. But of course, Peter couldn't be more wrong. It's the gate to all good adventure, as Lucy is about to discover. And even Edmund soon discovers it himself, but then lies about it. Edmund gave a very superior look, and then a little snigger, and said, "Oh yes, Lucy and I have been playing, pretending that all her story about a country in the wardrobe is true. Just for fun, of course. There's nothing there, really." Peter and Susan, disturbed by what's happening between their brother and sister, take their problem to the old professor. Peter tells the professor that they've tried to settle the truth of the matter by examining the wardrobe for themselves. "There was nothing there when we looked." Peter even rapped his knuckles on the back of the wardrobe to make sure. Narnia is a place, evidently, that won't offer up its secrets to the tests of empirical science. Narnia is a place that people sometimes lie about. Narnia is a place that people presuppose doesn't exist. But it turns out that it does exist. And all 4 children eventually learn that Narnia is not an utopia, a no place, but a utopia, a good place. Not a world that's nowhere, like Samuel Butler's Erewhon, but a world that's now here. The happy land of Narnia. Narnia of the heathery mountains and the thymy downs. Narnia of the many rivers, the plashing glens, the mossy caverns, and the deep forests ringing with the hammers of the dwarfs. Oh, the sweet air of Narnia, and ours life there is better than 1,000 years in Calaman. Was it Narni, the Umbrian hill town, or Inane, the Latin word that inspired the name of Lewis's invented country? Well, both, I think, and both in different ways connect to his beliefs about the real-world cosmos that at first looked empty to him, but turned out to be pulsing with divine purpose. Just as Narnia in the story is initially dismissed as nothing, but turns out to be real and radiant with sweet influence. The word Narnia is indeed a geographical signifier, yes, but it also has deep roots in Lewis's own journey of faith and interactions with Tolkien, in his work as a literary historian, in his writings as a novelist and poet, and in his vocation as an apologist engaging A.L. Rowse. As a result of all these things, the word Narnia is now, to paraphrase his letter to Titbit d'Alençon, one of the loveliest words, nothing to do with vacuity. Thank you very much.
Michael, thank you so much for that amazing talk. Thank you so much. And this is complete speculation, but do you have any evidence that, being that Flora spent 4 years of her childhood in Italy,
Sorry, I didn't catch that. Who spent?
Flora, his mother,
right.
Flora,
Right.
spent 4 years in Italy as a young girl. Do you think that might have influenced at all that choice, especially given that the wardrobe came from Diggory's mother's apple, right? Is there possibly some sort of origin story, perhaps any influence of the Italian?
Well, possibly. You know, so much of what I've been saying is possible. It's not provable, not demonstrable. But yes, any knowledge that Lewis acquired from any source about Italy, and Narnia in particular, is, of course, a possible contributory factor. But how you can ever determine that, how you could ever even identify all the possible tributaries is, as I say, unanswerable. We can only speculate, but we can, I hope, speculate more or less informedly and intelligently, and weighting the relevant possibilities with appropriate cautions. As I say, I myself don't think it's very likely that Tolkien's Narn played a part. I don't exactly know how I can explain why I think that, but I do. Whereas I think Inane from Mythopoeia is a stronger contender for influence. Likewise, I think it's fairly unlikely that Lewis knew how very often Rowse used the word inane, but I think it's highly probable that he saw the poem in Time and Tide. But I wanted to put all these possibilities in front of you so you can make your own mind up. You know, there are other things that we could consider too. What's his name? Jared Lobdell suggests in one place that a 1947 novel called Prince of Foxes might have played a part because it largely centers on Blessed Lucy of Narnia. Narnia has a local beata, a blessed, whose remains are deposited in the cathedral there. Walter Hooper liked to talk about that connection. Indeed, Walter named one of his cats Blessed Lucy of Narnia. But Walter very honestly admitted that there's no evidence that Lewis ever knew about Blessed Lucy of Narnia. So, I think that connection is again, very tenuous. Lewis wasn't especially interested in devotions to the saints. And if he'd been interested in Saint Lucy from Syracuse, we'd be reading the Chronicles of Syracusia. Blessed Lucy of Narnia is not a very well-known venerated personage. And I don't think Lewis knew about her. But again, that's a consideration you might bring to mind. And maybe Flora, in her trips to Italy, heard about her. Maybe she didn't. We cannot say.
That was Dr. Crystal Hurd. I am Charlie Starr. Michael, wonderful. I was struck by a certain quality in your argument, which I felt, and I feel this about Planet Narnia, it was incredibly Barfieldian. And I mean that in the best possible way. So I'm wondering if there is any kind of a deliberate approach in these wonderful interpretive things that you share with us, in which you think I am attempting to approach a topic the way Barfield might talk about it, the wonderful interconnectivity, the various meanings connected to other meanings and that sort of thing.
Well, I'm certainly not doing that deliberately, consciously, and I've not really read enough Barfield for that to be even a likely unconscious activity on my part, I'm afraid. So the answer is no. But that passage that brief sentence I read from Poetic Diction about love being the begetter of intimate knowledge is something that I take to heart and try to act upon, because, love is the great opener of eyes. Love can blind you, yes, but that might be better termed infatuation, because true love does not blind you. In fact, it opens your eyes ever more clearly to the beloved. And so I've taken that as a bit of a watchword in my own literary criticism. It's pointless studying books you don't like. You're never going to understand them very well. You should leave them alone.
Thank you so much for an illuminating talk, Dr. Ward. I want to ask you a question about your methodology and to talk us through what's the value of pursuing hypotheses that, even if they're not demonstrable, are nevertheless illuminating. And what would you say to a kind of sensibility that says we shouldn't bother pursuing hypotheses that are not demonstrable?
Thank you, Dr. Perez, my former doctoral student, asking me sorts of questions I used to ask you. What's your methodology? Good question. Fortunately, I was only writing a conference talk, not a doctoral thesis for Oxford University. my methodology is following my nose, really, seeing how this and that are similar, and then wondering whether they couldn't be connected. And I, in fact, had been thinking for a while about some connection between the meteorite and miracles and the First Chronicle of Narnia. And then when Joe Forty told me about this Time and Tide poem opposite the meteorite, I thought, that's what I've been looking for. That's the missing puzzle piece that I had hoped might exist. I could hardly believe what I was hearing when he told me about it. So that's, if I had a methodology, it's that, just remembering things that seem similar and might be connected, hoping you might stumble across something that shows they are connected, and then seeing what that reveals, if anything. Is that a sufficient defense of my methodology?
Andrew Lazo here. For decades, my greatest thoughts about Lewis are things that you've already considered, so I'm going to offer another and pass this off to Justin. But do you really mean, sir, said Peter, that there could be other worlds all over the place, just around the corner like that? Nothing is more probable. But I'm sure you've considered that.
Thank you. Well, yeah, once you start looking for the word nothing, it turns out to be a very common feature of Lewis's writings. Maybe it's got a double meaning, maybe it hasn't. But given the care with which Lewis wrote these books, there's almost nothing. There's hardly anything that you could get away with dismissing as a side product, a byproduct. You remember how Lewis talks about how humanity could hardly be more than a byproduct to the power that made the universe. But later he says a true artist, a great artist, has no byproducts, no accidental, fallout from a creative decision. No, every part of every sentence is designed with a purpose. That's, he talks about that, doesn't he, in Letters to Malcolm, the divine actus purus, the pure act by which God has created the world, exists for every part of it, down to the curve of every wave and the flight of every insect. There are no accidents, as Puddleglum says in The Silver Chair. It certainly seems to us like there are accidents from our mortal finite perspective. And Lewis is prepared to talk about, sheer meaningless coincidence in at least one of his works, by which I think he means meaningless to me. There's no way I can penetrate that meaning. But as an act of faith, he submits his ignorance to the omniscience of the divine creator, who, God willing, will one day reveal the mysteries of all these puzzling oddities and idiosyncrasies, and indeed tragedies that we experience in this life. So anyway, to answer your question, very possibly, yes, that also could have a double meaning. Yeah.
Justin Keena, and I'm glad that you just mentioned one of the passages where Lewis talks about meaninglessness. I wanted to propose to you one more subroute for the inane or inane Latin possible explanation, and that would be Lucretius. I was certain you were going to say Lucretius when you were talking about instead Marshall, but the system of atoms in void in Lucretius is his whole materialistic philosophy, and you can get this section of Surprised by Joy where he says, one had to look out on a meaningless dance of atoms. Remember, I was reading Lucretius. And he even quotes Lucretius in Latin in another place in Surprised by Joy. Lucretius in his book, which is his poem on the nature of things, is a 6-book explanation at length about how everything is just reducible to atoms and void. And one of the words he uses for void is inania. So that would be a place I think that you could definitely look for more. And my question would be, are there any other Latin sources you might have found? But I'm certain that Lewis had read that one.
Yeah. Well, as I said in my talk, I hadn't made anything like a comprehensive survey. So, I mean, I confess, I'm embarrassed to say I didn't even get as far as Lucretius, though you're quite right. That's the obvious place to look, given what Lewis says about him in Surprised by Joy. That's my answer. But thank you. There's a lot more to dig into here. I fully recognize that. Thank you. I will go and have a closer look at Lucretius.
Sometimes in the space of erudite scholarship, it's useful to look at inane ideas that appear banal. I think if we take a step back and go to The Magician's Nephew and look at the creation of Narnia out of nothing, out of total blackness, where there's a showering song of life that springs forth, the idea is at least accretive to your argument that indeed this wonderful Narnia is created out of nothing.
Yes. Loved into existence by its creator, from nothing to something. Yes, absolutely. Creation ex nihilo is an important part of Christian doctrine, and indeed, I think one of the reasons why Lewis and Barfield, moved apart, because, as Lewis says somewhere, in anthroposophy, that there's not really a possible ontological distinction between creator and creature. Creation is more like an emanation of the creator than a creation ex nihilo. And that was one of the reasons why Lewis was so shocked by his friend's conversion to anthroposophy, and why he never embraced it himself. Yeah, thank you. That's an interesting line of thought. And again, puts me in mind of certain things he says in Letters to Malcolm about there's an almost tragic, Jardiel, you pick up on this, an almost tragic aspect to creation, whereby God wills into existence something which is other than him and separate from him and not part of him. But then in the comedic return, by means of which creation is reunited in love with its creator, you get the circle being completed. Jardiel, have you thought about that? That's an interesting line of inquiry. But thank you. That's a good question.
We have 4 hands raised,
right.
and 5th one, I see one, but I have to be the bad guy. Would you please join me in thanking Dr. Ward for his wonderful talk?